What would you guess this number is? What does it represent? It's a number that's so unfathomably large your mind may immediately jump to a number in space. Oh yeah, maybe the distance to Pluto. That planet's pretty far away. Nope, not even close. Okay, maybe something tiny in our biological system. I've heard there's a lot of neurons in the human. No, actually, that number right there, that's the US national debt. Let me explain. I'm sure you've seen some of the headlines, and maybe you haven't, but in either case, it seems the word debt has lost some of its meaning. National debt is defined as the total amount of money that a country's government has borrowed. Borrow meaning the intention of paying it back, of course. Now, you tell me, how the hell does the US plan on paying back $32.5 trillion? And the US isn't alone in this seemingly impossible endeavor. In fact, most of the countries on planet Earth are in debt, and a lot of it. So why does this even matter? You and I can continue spending money at our own leisure. The world doesn't end. Life goes on, until it doesn't, of course. What are the consequences of printing money to oblivion? And how in the world did we get to where we are today? Of course, it's impossible to know for certain what the consequences may be, but we can certainly identify the patterns that have occurred throughout history to give us a better idea. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. And I'll remind you, we've seen this story 1 or 2 times before. The Holy Roman Empire was the most powerful political entity in the world for 500 years during its peak, and lasted for nearly 1,000 years total. However, due to runaway inflation, a fractured economy, lack of civilian confidence, heavy taxes, and many other factors, it eventually came to a rather surprising demise. A seemingly invincible world power known for their incredible engineering feats, more technologically advanced than any other civilization on the planet at that time, falls. An empire that had everything. Too big to fail, right? No, the fall of the Romans was etched in stone far, far before the invasion and conquering of their home soil. And it all started with the Great Debasement. The Great Debasement is the beginning of the end for all great nations and empires to ever exist on this planet. A slow death, a financial suicide that starts far, far before any signs of deterioration. Like a disease that spreads slowly but only grows stronger with time, the Great Debasement takes tens, hundreds of years before it is already too late. But before we understand what that actually means, we need to look at how it starts. Debt is the borrowing of money, so naturally we start by looking at the money, the currency. During the peak of their power, the Romans' primary currency was known as the denarius and the aureus. Denarius was a small silver coin nearly the size of a US nickel today, and the aureus was a gold coin that was worth 25 times the denarius. In their early stages, the coins were minted with a very high purity of metal, making it extremely valuable in trade. Naturally, you may ask, well, what makes a coin made out of silver and gold valuable? Gold and silver have been universally recognized as a means of exchange for thousands of years. Precious metals are limited in supply and have many practical uses. Today, gold is used in electronics, dentistry, medical equipment, and other industries like defense, aerospace, and automotive. So inherently, using the basic principles of supply and demand, people tend to agree that these metals have value. A money system, a currency, is built on value. It's more practical. It allows people to make transactions and redeem their currency for items they may need. Instead of having to lug around gold bars everywhere you go, you can simply hold coins in your pocket and make an exchange when necessary. In its early days, this new bimetallic monetary system was extremely effective for the Romans. Trading became easier and more convenient than it ever had before, and as a result, The empire and its influence on the world economy grew fast. But as their power and influence expanded, so did their costs. To keep up with this impressive growth, Roman emperors were forced to make a choice. They needed to find a new way of financing, a new way to pay for things, and fast. The Coinage Act of 1792 laid out the framework for the United States' new bimetallic monetary system. What do you know? Gold and silver would be the official currency of the country, following in the footsteps of international trade. Pure gold would be worth 15 times that of pure silver, and early operations with this new monetary system were quite smooth. The United States was able to expand quickly, and soon millions of immigrants came from other countries in pursuit of a better life in the new democracy. As the US occupied more territory and expanded their international influence, costs began to mount. By 1861, the Civil War broke out, and the government could no longer keep up with the expenses. Total expenses now surpassed the value of all American precious metals. In a last-ditch effort, the government issued the greenback, its first try at fiat currency. As you could imagine, this is a foreshadowing of future issues. The government was able to print as much money as they pleased and fund any projects that they wanted to work on. Like today, this fiat money had no intrinsic value. Intrinsic meaning no value on its own. Nobody's gonna pay you for a piece of paper. This is different from the intrinsic value of precious metals per se. Gold by default has intrinsic value. There is natural demand for gold because of its various use cases. So as the government began to print more and more of this fiat money, inflation took hold of the economy. The value of this money deteriorated very quickly, and the government was forced to remove all bills from circulation soon after. By 1871, an international gold standard was established by Germany, completely replacing silver with gold. Other nations, including the United States, followed shortly after. So everybody bring back your fiat currency, bring back your dollars, because now the paper currency is backed by gold. It has intrinsic value. All paper currency could be exchanged for physical gold on demand at a fixed price of $20.67 per ounce. And now it seems like all sunshine and butterflies. The US dollar is now pegged to gold at a fixed rate. However, the US government continued to spend at unprecedented rates. Naturally, people were losing confidence in banks' ability to pay out physical money. Now, we aren't going to dive into the details of how the banking system works, but this fundamental concept is crucial to understand. A bank holds your money, pays you an interest rate, so you are incentivized to hold your money there, and loans out your money at a higher interest rate to make a profit, also known as arbitrage. The bank loans the money to an institution that loans it to someone else, who eventually loans it out to someone else. And you start to question if the bank could even pay you back if you wanted your money out. Well, that's exactly what happened. The Panic of 1907 resulted in people scrambling to get their hard-earned money out of banks and into physical possession. In response, and to protect banks from failure, in 1913, the Federal Reserve was formed to protect banks and provide emergency relief when necessary, a backstop. However, the idea of a temporary institution didn't last very long. As you can see, they're still thriving and printing money today. The Federal Reserve would go on to declare themselves the permanent kings of credit creation and economic growth. The Great Debasement had officially begun. Throughout the 1920s, also known as the Roaring Twenties, industrial growth in the US exploded. People took advantage of this economic boom by using margin to invest, borrowed money. The emergency relief Federal Reserve was loaning out money for free at nearly 0% interest. All of these factors culminated in the circulation of money supply ballooning, and although the US dollar was still technically pegged to gold at a fixed ratio, the perfect storm was already brewing. Rome was undergoing similar circumstances. With rising costs and the inability to pay with their current supply of precious metals, the Romans needed more money. So, to increase the money supply and keep up with the steepening expenses, Roman leaders began to decrease the purity of their coinage. Why, you may ask, and what does that mean? Well, now they could create more silver coins with less silver. However, the coins still maintained the same face value. And this marks the beginning of the Great Debasement in Rome, a very slippery slope of ultimate consequence. You see, once the deviation of face value and intrinsic value of a currency occurs, it's almost always irreversible. Over the next couple hundred of years, the purity of the Roman denarius, the silver coin, decreased from 100% to nearly zero. The floodgates had opened and economic collapse as well as hyperinflation was inevitable. Their currency had essentially become worthless. As a Roman historian once said, from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. April 5th, 1933. FDR, 32nd President of the US and widely considered one of the best to ever do it, signs the infamous and controversial Executive Order 6102, banning the private ownership of gold. All gold was to be forcefully sold to the government at $20.67 an ounce. And immediately after the mass confiscation, FDR raised the price of gold to $35 an ounce, devaluing the dollar by 41% in just one day. Why not just hide your gold, you ask? Well, penalties included a fine of up to $10,000 equal to $226,000 today and up to 10 years in prison. So yeah, I guess you could say people just didn't want to take that risk. And despite appearing criminal at worst and unconstitutional at best, this move by the government was a calculated attempt to revive the economy during the tough years of the Great Depression. You see, the government wanted to increase the money supply, a boost which would ideally increase spending and kickstart the economy, but needed more gold in their possession to do so. Per the international gold standard, 40% of the value of paper currency in circulation must be backed by gold at all times. So the US government needed a massive influx of gold to increase the supply of money circulation in the economy. As you may have expected, this mass confiscation would go on to change the US economy forever. The gold standard was being enforced in theory, but in practice, it was already too late. By raising the price dramatically following the mass confiscation, the debasement and devaluation of currency was already well under its way. After World War II, nearly every major financial system, population, and landscape had been decimated. However, the US remained relatively unscathed, and they took advantage of this opportunity. They established the US dollar as the international reserve currency. With this, the United States became a financial world power, allowing the government to borrow money from international governments more easily and impose painful sanctions at their own discretion. And with power can typically come the abuse of power. Over the next 25 years, spending by the US government exploded. Questionable wartime efforts in the Vietnam War, welfare programs, and bold political agendas drove the US expenses to inconceivable heights. For reference, the Vietnam War cost $168 billion, or $1 trillion in today's dollars. And it doesn't stop there. Compensation benefits for Vietnam vets and families still cost $22 billion per year to this day. As US spending jumped, international confidence dropped. You remember the international gold standard. At least 40% of currency in circulation must be backed by gold at all times. Well, eventually in 1971, France put the United States to the test. France began to aggressively exchange US dollars for gold, and the US gold reserves were quickly depleting, leaving the United States with one of two options: give their entire gold supply to France, or the complete and absolute debasement of currency, the termination of the gold standard. They chose the second one. All global currencies would now be transitioned to a floating rate exchange system, essentially a system based on the relative supply and demand of other currencies. The key being no relation whatsoever to precious metals, anything of intrinsic value. Governments were now free to print as much money as they pleased. Now I may ask, what do you think the reaction of the economy was to the termination of the international gold standard? Any wild guesses? What happened when the Romans reduced the purity of their coinage from 100 to 0, removing all of the intrinsic value but keeping the face value, the extrinsic value, constant? Well, inflation, of course. Shortly after the abandonment of the gold standard, the price of oil jumped 400%, economic growth stalled, inflation surged, and stocks flat out sucked. However, one of the few assets that stayed strong in the face of disastrous economic conditions was, you guessed it, gold. The price soaring 24x in just a short 7 years following the debasement. The value of gold symbolizes the collapse in value of the US dollar over time. And that dynamic still exists today. The money supply has grown ever since, and so has the price of gold. This is nothing new. The Great Debasement is a slow process that begins as a harmless move to increase money supply and encourage economic growth, but eventually grows into an unstoppable, destructive force. The Roman Empire is just one example, but far from the only one. As the purity of Roman coins dropped, merchants demanded more coins to assure that their payments in gold and silver would be worth the same as before. 7 Chinese dynasties introduced paper currency and used it to buy vast luxuries, to have runaway inflation rapidly depreciate the value to 0. When conquered by invaders or rebels, the new rulers issued their own paper currency, only to reach the same demise over and over. It's like clockwork. The English king, Henry VIII, went bankrupt during his reign, spending ridiculous sums of wealth on his palaces, government employees, the British Navy, and wars with France. How did he alleviate this issue? Well, he reduced the purity of coins, of course, from 92.5%, which it had been for the past 400 years, gradually to 33%. Since 1900, central banks have been solely responsible, the engine for printing money that countries don't have. In 1923, post-World War I Germany blamed their debt and inflation on the reparations demanded by their victorious enemies. But this is far from the truth. Germany provided health insurance, government programs, bailed out institutions, built lavish theaters, opera houses, and art galleries, but proceeded to blame the reparations that accounted for only 11.8% of the government's budget. Come on now. The age of starving billionaires. People had billions of paper marks but couldn't even afford a loaf of bread. All of these examples to show you just how punishing the Great Debasement can be. And unfortunately today, the world's currencies are as debased as they ever have been. Global debt has hit a record of $300 trillion. About 3 times that of the world's total GDP. That's an average of $37,500 of debt per person across the entire globe. Alright, now we have to reel this conversation back in a bit. Take a deep breath. It's not all doom and gloom. Debt is not always a bad thing. In fact, debt allows people like you and me to attend university and get a bachelor's degree. It allows businesses to take out loans and invest in their future. It encourages economic growth. And with time, debt becomes less expensive. Dollars in the future are generally worth less than they are today. And it's been that way since the Federal Reserve was instituted and started ripping the money printers. So when you pay back your debt at a later time, that will be less expensive than if you were to pay for it all today, right now. However, that begs the question, how much debt is too much debt? And that's really the question we're trying to answer. It's impossible to identify just how much nominal debt the Roman Empire was in, but the signs of too much debt were certainly evident. And interestingly enough, several of these early signs are shared by present-day United States and the rest of the world. First and most alarming, the debasement of currency. Once being backed by gold and silver to eventually not being backed by anything at all. 2, a significant budget was allocated to building out military dominance. As a world power, it is mission critical to establish the strongest military possible. The Roman Empire dedicated up to 67% of their entire annual budget to their army. And likewise today, the US blows away the rest of the global competition, making up nearly half of the world's total military spending. 3. Excessive spending on welfare programs, political agendas, and social initiatives. To ensure equality and a good standard of living, it is crucial to dedicate spending to these categories. But this was one of the Roman Empire's biggest mistakes. Rome's first subsidized food program provided discounted grain to poor citizens. Over time, anybody who waited in grain lines was entitled to the discount, not just poor people. Sometimes rich politicians were spotted waiting in line, and not too long after, the discounted grain was replaced with entirely free grain, and 1/3 of the Roman population was reaping the benefits. And don't get me wrong, nobody wants to see another human being starve or suffer. But over time, we can see the financial ruin that will result from people taking advantage of these welfare programs. Everybody knows that welfare programs are absolutely necessary to protecting poorer individuals. But at some point, it no longer becomes a temporary safety net, but rather a perpetual assistance that people feel entitled to receive. 4. Debt bubbles grow quickly, but take a long time to pop. Rome operated in a state of currency devaluation and debt buildup for hundreds of years. The United States, although with a current debt of $30 trillion, has only been operating at a budget deficit for the last 200 some odd years. In fact, the last time the United States was debt-free was 1835. God. We could go on for hours about the glaringly similar economic circumstances in the ancient Roman Empire and today's United States. But there are two massive differences that we haven't discussed yet. Principles of economics have existed for millennia, but have evolved significantly over time. The three major running economic theories today are Keynesian, neoclassical, and Marxian, all exhibiting different aspects and behaviors that are believed to be optimal for an economy. Now, we don't care about all the details, at least I don't, but what is critical is the role that government plays in each of these theories. For our purposes, we will focus on Keynesian, as that's the theory that the US follows. Keynesian economists justify government intervention through public policies that aim to achieve full employment and price stability, and that's exactly what the Federal Reserve is put in place to do. But today, there is a much bigger theory in the works. Modern monetary theory states that countries control their own currencies and are not constrained by revenues when it comes to spending. Did you catch that? In other words, spend as much money as you want. It doesn't matter. Infinite. Who cares? No constraints. I don't know about you, but eventually this seems like it would have some consequences, right? Well, I guess we'll see. The second massive difference between the all-powerful Roman Empire and today's United States is the financial tools that are available to us. Here's an exercise. Just log on to your Robinhood or brokerage of choice and check out all of the options tools that are available to you. These features are known as leveraged products or derivatives, allowing you to control money with virtually no money at all. Options, futures, warrants, just a few that come to mind. They derive their value from an underlying asset, like a stock, but rely on many complex variables. Options, for example, rely on timing, volatility, volume, etc., also known as the Greeks, to determine the price of the asset. Things today are complicated. Money is lent out hundreds of times. Just look at failed crypto exchange FTX, for example. They loaned out their customers' assets several times, loaning to institutions, who loaned to customers, who loaned to friends and family. You can see just how complex and convoluted today's financial system can be. So naturally, with this amount of complexity, the ability for people to take advantage without others even knowing is much more feasible. And because of this, the debt ceiling for the United States may be considerably higher than that of the Roman Empire. But at some point, taking on this ridiculous amount of debt just isn't sustainable. At least that's what history tells us. With all this being said, I probably sound like the boy who cried wolf and looking for the doomsday scenario, but that's not what I'm trying to do. This is really just for perspective. Synthesizing today's events and circumstances with history has proven to be valuable. But who knows? The financial system could collapse tomorrow, could collapse in next year, maybe 10 years, maybe 100 years. Nobody knows the answer. But eventually, there will be a time of ultimate consequence. And nobody knows what that might look like, but the time will come. I hope you learned something from this, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace!